Don't you love when technology works? Hey, everybody, welcome back to On the Schmooze, the live version where we record things and we never know what's going to happen, but you can listen to all the episodes at ontheschmooze.com. There are over 370 episodes in the archives. Today's guest I met at a conference last summer. And one of the things I love about hosting a podcast is that this gives me a reason to check back in with people and have a bit of an in-depth conversation, which you all get to listen into. So without any further delay, let me introduce this week's guest. Today's guest is a transformative figure in workplace culture and inclusivity. He is not just an advocate for belonging in the workplace, he's a trailblazer in the truest sense. With two best-selling books, Belonging at Work and Imagine Belonging, he has become a guiding light for executives, leaders, and visionaries committed to cultivating environments where safety, trust, and a sense of belonging are paramount. Beyond his consulting work, he stands at the forefront of DEI discourse as a keynote speaker and host of the Belonging at Work Summit and two popular podcasts, Imagine Belonging at Work and The Out Entrepreneur. His journey is as diverse as it is impressive, spanning roles at the White House, Department of Justice, and PFLAG National. His insights have graced the pages of Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, and other notable publications. He partners with industry giants, government agencies, and large nonprofits to foster workplace cultures that prioritize psychological safety and trust. Please join me in welcoming Rhodes Perry. Welcome, Rhodes.
Robbie, it's so great to be here. That was an incredible intro too. What a talent. I'm like, can you write my bio for me? That was
Feel free to
amazing.
copy it.
Yeah,
Others guests have asked that off air, but I will give you
what a
permission
talent.
on air.
That's such a talent. Thank you. Thank
I'm
you.
going to give a shout out to Paya Robbins, my assistant of just about 4 years now, who is really good at grabbing information from my guests from around the web and crafting these intros, which I love because it brings people into the conversation. You're joining us from Portland, Oregon. Thrilled to have you here by the power of technology. As you know, there's a show about building strong networks, and the context is leadership. So tell me, how do you define leadership, and when did you realize you had the skills to lead?
I love that question, the two-part question. And really simply, I think leadership is the ability to inspire and motivate people, a group of people, maybe more than two people, to take action together, right? And I think for me, really simply, being a little kid, right? And just kind of, I don't know, kind of like being the person that brought the kids in the neighborhood together to have fun, to have an idea of like, some of the games that we would play, that translated later into playing sports, being a team captain, being identified to go to leadership development events and things of that nature. So it's kind of just been a part of me my whole life. And identities that we share. I'm a trans man, and I think like being openly trans and kind of trying to build a better world for those of us in our communities is so important to me. So I think that just kind of adds to my path of being a leader, and now working with so many people, helping them develop those skills to be a leader.
Man, I love that definition you start off with around, really ultimately about inspired action,
Mm.
like inspiring others to take that direction and like move forward and make progress. And I
Yeah.
also really appreciate that you went back far enough in. Sometimes I ask people this question, they say, "Well, when I was 28 getting out of grad school." And I'm like, what were you like as a kid? And you went right there. So clearly you were the kid organizing other people in the playground, your neighborhood to go and do things. Do you have any siblings? Like,
Yeah, I have an older brother. So for me, I was the tag along kid too. So I'm like, whatever he does, I want to do, and then I would always have a say. And like what we would like, are we playing football today? Are we playing tag? So yeah. I'm curious why you ask. Is
well, I
that
was kind of curious about where, like, sometimes the pecking order of siblings, it also leads to some, natural leadership. Like you're almost required to have better leadership because you're the older child. But the fact that you described yourself as a tag along kid,
yeah,
but also you clearly were collaboratively creating some play, which gave you the skill to then also be doing that with your friends, your peers,
yeah,
and as opposed to just always waiting for someone else to decide like what's happening today. And
sure.
then that also translates, it sounds like, into more formal leadership roles in school. And that you sounds like you were part of some sports teams. Were you involved with other after school activities? Did teachers sort of seek you out and put you into these opportunities in these different like expectations of roles?
Yeah, there was now I'm going to be specific. My junior year of high school, there was this opportunity. So there were a number of schools in our county, and they selected two people, and it was based on gender, two girls, two boys, to go to Colorado. So I grew up in Florida. I had never been to, I didn't have a whole lot of travel by that point. To go to Colorado, to go to this ranch and learn leadership skills. And I was like, what? Wow, okay, sure. And it was largely, I think, because of academics and school, sports, that people, at least the teachers of the school were like, okay, these are the two kids who are going to select for the girls and the boys. And it was transformational too, because I was kind of like, okay, this will be fun. I'll go to Colorado. I'll learn some things. And it's one of those experiences, as you look back as a child or a young adult, where it's like, no, that was transformational, and it was really powerful. And so yeah, that was one of many of those kind of opportunities where, really trusted mentors that were either teachers or coaches saw something in me that felt accurate, and I think that, especially growing up and trying to figure out my gender, adults usually got that wrong 9 times out of 10. So it was nice for them to see an aspect that's really central to who I am as being a leader, and having that valued, for others to see that in me. And that certainly helped build confidence, right? So yeah.
I feel like there's a lot to unpack there, starting with the fact that you grew up in Florida.
Oof, yeah.
But you also talk about this particular pivotal moment, and it sounds like you got access to some kind of leadership training that a lot of adults don't get access to, and get thrown into leadership roles. And at a very very young age, like you started to nuance this question of leadership in a way that a lot of us grapple with much later. So
Mhm,
it's really interesting. It made me think of something that I did years later, like not as a child, but as an adult. It
mhm.
was a retreat in Vermont where there was maybe 20 of us, half were environmental activists and half were social justice activists. So
Yeah,
one way to think of it is half the room cared about the earth and half the room cared about the people.
yeah,
And they
this
didn't
is
really pay a lot of attention to the other part. And this was an organization that was trying to get us to think more holistically about this work and
yeah,
how our campaigns impact each other. And I similarly, like, it's 11 years ago, and I still think about that week and like what that experience was like. So to have that in high school, like,
right,
I'm like, that's
yeah,
really cool. And considering that today you are a trainer and a facilitator and a guide, it also sounds like you really saw that potential at an age. But when you were 12, did you have any sense of what you were going to be when you grew up? Was there like a path in front of you laid out by your desires or your family's expectations? Was college a given? Like, where did you think was going to happen, at when you were getting out of high school?
yeah. Well, as a young person, I grew up. So we were talked about Florida. I grew up in Central Florida, which is the Space Coast, and so up until about the age of 6, I really wanted to be an astronaut. I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. Um, and in 1986, I walked down my driveway because we could see the shuttles launch from where we lived, which was really cool. I did see the Challenger disaster, which was, as a little kid, I didn't really know what was happening. And I was like, oh, I guess that's what it does when it launches sometimes. And I realized what had happened later, and so that quickly ended my dreams of being an astronaut. But I knew, like, I felt like I wanted to do something that was, just uh, something that was a path that not many people would take, right? And um, it and where I grew up, college was an expectation, right? And certainly from my family, the professional options were, you're going to law school or you're going to medical school because you're really good at school. So those are the things that you do. And yeah, so I thought, when I went to Notre Dame for undergrad, and I thought that I wanted to be a lawyer. So I studied economics and gender studies because I was interested in gender, and I got to learn about myself and be openly trans. I started my transition at 19, which was interesting, doing at a pretty conservative school. Um, yeah, but I ended up working for the Department of Justice thinking I was on that law track. And I realized really quickly, I don't want to interpret laws. I want to help kind of create them. I want to create policy. I want to create a different world. And that started a wild career path that was really super interesting, and a few twists and turns that have landed me to where I'm at now, doing the consulting work that I do.
All right, I'm definitely want to hear more about those twists and turns in a moment, but you just brought up your transition at 19. I'm kind of curious what year about is that, just
Yeah,
to place in my
1999.
own.
Yeah, 1999, a really, really different world where definitely less than 10% of US adults knew or worked with someone who is trans. So,
Yeah. Okay. So, all right, this is fascinating. I'm just trying to place it all. So I was in college. I started college in 92. 99, I was in grad school. Um, Somewhere in between that, I went to my first LGBT conference, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, which is now National LGBTQ Task Force. And it was 95, and Transsexual Menace
yeah,
was there
yeah,
talking of Phyllis, I believe, if I remember her last name. She was there, and they were like, she was a lawyer, and she was really fighting the laws. And like, that was so interesting to think about how we fight in the courts, not just in the streets.
yeah,
And bisexuality was still not a given to be part of the community. I mean, I'm sure it is today, but more so than it was.
yeah,
And the 90s were all about that, and like people adding tea without really understanding how to provide services for people who identified as trans.
yes,
Yeah, so I was sort of around in that space,
yeah,
and I kind of wandered into that space in a college campus as a person who thought of myself as an advocate, as an activist, but someone who lacked any personal experience with the LGBT community and was completely clueless about my own place in it.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
I get
and
that.
I will tell you, Rhodes, that other people perceived me, I find out later,
Mm,
as being out because of the way I carried myself, the way I moved in the world, the way I dressed, the way I acted. And people thought I was very butch, which is funny because I haven't changed the way I behave, and no one thinks that now.
yeah, yeah,
So in 1999, that's wild. So 5 years later is when I started transitioning. We have a little bit of an age difference only by a few years, but part of what influenced me when I was about 29 was meeting someone who was 21 who had transitioned a few years earlier,
yes,
and was sort of at the like post, like they were just living. They were like not grappling with all this, you know? And I thought, man, like could I just move forward?
yeah,
So the idea that you had that presence back then when it wasn't widely known, I'm kind of curious about the supports you had to have space to figure that out, or was it just so necessary? Like, were you just so painfully aware of that difference that you had to figure out what that meant? Like,
yeah.
how did you grapple with that in the 90s when again it was such a uncommon idea?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing part of your story too. I'm like, oh, okay, you too. And yeah, I think for me it was so that 1999. So I was 19, and I believe it was that summer. So here's my 44-year-old brain trying to remember these things. I interned at the National Organization for Women, believe it or not, and there I met so many incredible activists. It was my first time in DC, like living there for 3 weeks or 3 months. And I was like, this is so cool. And at the time, the organization was grappling with, they had just made the decision that when we talk about women, we're talking about all women. And it was a huge, huge decision for a national feminist organization to include trans women, right? And so much so that they were shedding membership, right? And so they had a national conference that year where people like Ricky Wilchins, right, from Gender Pack, right? So I think maybe Ricky came from the transsexual menace group. Not sure of that lineage, but yeah. Anyway, they were this group of trans and non-binary folks. Although at the time people were describing themselves as gender queer, came to the conference and talk about proximity. My first time being in community with people that are my community, but I didn't realize until that moment. And it took me some time to grapple with sharing publicly um, that I'm a trans man, right? And I think partly for me was the loss at the time of recognizing I can be an ally of women's only spaces, and that space is not for me. I need another space. I need to find my community. And so that was a period of the summer going into March. I think March 8th is kind of International Women's Day. And I remember going with all of my friends that I met and worked with at Now, and their thinking was, we're marching in solidarity. And it was at that moment, and I remember it's Washington, D.C. It was at Malcolm X Park, where there's a giant statue of Joan of Arc, gold statue. And, I remember sharing with like those that I trusted the most, like, hey, I'm here as an ally. I just want you to know I'm a trans guy, and I'm on this path. And they were very, very supportive. Not, there were a lot of people in my life that weren't, but that response, that really positive, affirming response, really gave me courage to continue on a path that, just as I would never imagine this path as that my 6-year-old self watching the shuttle launch, and I'm so grateful for it. I'm so grateful for it. So I really relate to you, just when you find someone that can be that possibility model of like, oh, I like how you are in the world, and there's something about you that I see myself in, that really gave me a lot of courage to kind of move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I could man, I can relate to your story so much. And for me, it was like everyone wanted to know labels, like it was very label heavy moments.
Mm.
And I spent like a year saying, like, I don't know, who cares? I was wearing like a Guess jeans dog tags that had a question mark with a triangle.
I love
People
that.
would bother me and I would like hold it up. And again, years later, what I came to understand was there was the people who like loved me for it and thought it was awesome. And then
Yeah.
there were people who had a lot of problems with it, who later would disclose how much they were grappling with identity and didn't feel comfortable disclosing that, they were bi. And, it was like they were the head of an organization and they were supposed to be like the gay man on campus. And my freedom, I like, who cares? Let's just be, I was like really bothering them. But then I would attract the people I, needed to have around me. And it was like through all of that that I started to like recognize there was a moment actually, Rhodes. The last time I wore a dress was for a drag ball that I helped organize for my college campus. And 3 weeks before the event, we were sitting there talking about what we were going to wear. And I was like, well, I wear a tie on a random Tuesday. So it wouldn't make sense for me to dress up in
Mhm.
men's attire because,
Yeah.
like, that I would just do.
Yeah.
And so I went to this thrift store and I bought like someone's prom dress. I bought heels. The heels lasted for less than 30 minutes. The outfit itself lasted 90 minutes. I brought a change of clothes.
Yeah.
But
Get
it was that those are the beginnings of me sort of recognizing who I was.
that. Mhm.
I went to grad school in my, right after undergrad, and I went for social work, and I was reading the DSM then for,
Mhm.
and kept rereading the section around trans
Mhm.
and thinking, I don't know. And the reason I couldn't place myself in it is that it was not slowing me down. It was not harming my life. And
Right.
like that was all the diagnosis was all about it's
Mhm.
getting in your way. It's
Yeah.
causing you harm. And I was like, I mean,
Mhm.
but I had designed a life where it really wasn't holding me back. And so I went through 2 years of grad school still not being able to like specifically name this. And it was only by being introduced to the community in Boston. I dated someone in Boston who was the whole transgender queer community in Boston.
Mhm.
Shout out to Gunnar Scott at the
Yeah,
time, who was such a
Gunnar.
huge
Yeah.
leader in our work
Oh,
up
yeah.
in Boston. And people like him creating these spaces. But I think, like you said, finding the people who are modeling for you, who were leading the way at a time when it was rare.
Yeah.
And one of the things I really appreciate about what you do today, and we will get more detail into the work you do today, but you're one of the rare out trans people I know who is not specifically and only focused on trans inclusion work.
Yes.
And I can really relate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because people will call me all the time, like, "Oh, can you come do a trans 101?" And I'm like, "I don't really have that." It's
Yeah.
like in college, I did a few LGBT one-on-one sessions, but a lot's changed. Like, I don't have that.
Yeah.
And you and I really connect around the word belonging, and I can tell that for you, that's what you were trying to figure out was
Yeah.
where you fit in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So you went to college, by the way, and you went for gender studies. What were you gonna do with your degree? Like, did you continue on the path of law school, or you were pretty much done with that plan pretty
Oh,
quickly
yeah.
and you weren't into policy or something? Like, how
Yeah.
did you move forward in the early parts of your career?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it was a economics and gender studies degree. So the economics part definitely helped with like the next actions. And that was really, I knew that I wanted to kind of have some time in between undergrad and whatever was going to be next. If I was going to get another degree, I wanted to get some experience. I wanted to know, do I really want to be a lawyer? And so there was this great opportunity. There was a big kind of college recruitment event that happened, and I talked to a lot of companies, and I met up with a recruiter for the Department of Justice. And obviously the DOJ is huge, and in my heart, I wanted to do human rights law, right? Like, of course, and so there was an opportunity to be an honors paralegal. So you get on this track where you go for like you basically work for the DOJ for a year or two, and then there's an opportunity to go to law school, and there's some benefits to that program basically. And I really clicked with the guy who, Steve Duplicki, if he's still around today. Really great. I think he was a member of the broader LGBTQ plus community. And I shared with him, I was just like, I don't want to be in the closet, and at the time I just kind of shared more about my sexual orientation. So I was sharing, I'm a bisexual person. So, and he's like, great, that's awesome. Like, we want you. And so I was like, cool. And this was, when I graduated in 2002. So, yes, like at that point, Bill Clinton was done. So it was definitely the George W. Bush era. So John Ashcroft was ultimately our boss. So I'm like, really? Like, I can be out in this, what I thought was a pretty scary administration at the time. And so anyway, I got
Well, our
that
point of
job.
view of what's scary in an administration has certainly changed since the early
Yes.
aughts.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, and it was true. Like, the climate there was pretty good. I joined an employee resource group called Gates. I don't know if that's still around today, but it was for gay and lesbian, federal employees. So I was like, well, let's expand that definition a little bit and include the B and the T. And, that's where we were at that time. And I realized, as I worked there for the time that I did, I really appreciated my colleagues who were attorneys. I worked in the antitrust division, which today I'm really grateful for, mergers, acquisitions, where you're trying to make sure monopolies don't exist. So at that time, they were just finishing up a lawsuit of the federal government fighting Microsoft as kind of a operating system monopoly. And in that process, this is the early aughts. We weren't allowed to use Microsoft products. So we were using WordPerfect to do our jobs. Oh my God. Anyway, I still have work trauma from that.
I
And
never thought about the repercussions of that in that particular context, but I
right.
guess, yeah, it kind of makes sense. You're fighting them, so you're not using the product. But
Yeah.
it is sort of funny that you had to work with something else.
Antiquated, really antiquated.
Yeah.
It made our jobs pretty hard. I realized, long story short, that going down that path was not for me. And so I ended up I got my master's of public administration with a focus on nonprofit management, like government agency management, focusing in on policy work. And it's not everyone's cup of tea. I really loved it because I was thinking about just my early experiences of the workplace and thinking about organizational design, how we manage teams, and just how much room there was to grow to bring our human to work, as Erica Keshman says, which is just like, let's bring our human to work. And it didn't feel at that time that those conversations were really happening at the scale they are today. And I really wanted to do more of that work. And I wanted to do LGBTQ policy work in particular, kind of looking at the workplace from that angle. And everyone, I went to NYU, and I was thinking, okay, this is not Notre Dame. It's going to be super progressive. My professors are going to see my vision. And I remember I had a professor who was basically like, you're not going to find a job doing that. And so I just have to say, we don't have to go and fill in all the blanks, but I did find a job doing that. And I had great satisfaction every day I showed up where I'm like, I'm doing LGBT policy work. So anyway,
That's
that,
amazing. I mean, there's a way in which you were carving out a history, or I would say you were carving out a future that was not based on a known history. Like you were building and scaffolding as you were doing it. Whereas today, there are lots of different conversations around being human at work, or variations of that. I mean, I can think even now about things on LinkedIn I've seen around even Black women in hair. This is the hashtag. This is what a professional looks like. There's even a hashtag inked in.
Oh, I love that.
My favorite one. Love that. And just like all these, human at work is really kind of the core of it, but different angles, LGBT, racial, socioeconomic angles to people feel like they want to have a workplace that allows them to be more of themselves. And that conversation had to start somewhere. And it sounds like you were really on the beginning edges, the pioneering edges of those conversations based on your understanding and experience and exposure to some really big organizations early in your career. I think you were seeing things that maybe other people weren't. But the way I know you today is that you are providing, training and resources to organizations. Like, if I were meeting with somebody and I suddenly had this like light bulb moment that I had to introduce them to you because they would be a great prospect,
Mm.
what would the person be saying to me or complaining about for me to think, oh my gosh, you've got to meet my friend Rhodes?
Yeah, I would say, fear around advancing their diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, right? From a leadership perspective, because I work with executive leadership teams, largely people who hold dominant identities, largely people who kind of look like me, right? Like white men who get it, have made some investments. So they're not brand new. Their company's not starting from square one. However, they're getting pushback now, and they themselves don't know the why. They don't know how to explain it. And they want to. They want to understand it. They want to model behaviors that are in alignment with their values. And that's my sweet spot. I really love that. I love empowering people who who kind of get it, but need more, and they want to be champions and they're afraid of doing the wrong things, so they remain silent, which creates a whole host of other problems. And yeah, so that's where I would start. And another angle of what I do is I have a community of largely DEI pros. So those of us either internally in larger organizations or other consultants who are looking for a community of practitioners around obviously celebrating successes big and small. I love starting there because the work does work when done well. And also really troubleshooting those challenges where, wow, and we never thought that our field would be on the political agenda in a major presidential election. And here we are. What do we do? Right? Like and that's the kind of power of those spaces too. So kind of folks that are kind of somewhere in the middle trying to get this work, and also practitioners that are deep, like we are parachuting off of innovation, and we really need to kind of have a safer space just to kind of um, troubleshoot or kind of tweak our ideas before presenting them to external audiences.
So now I'm curious how you made your first forays into entrepreneurship. Like, were you starting as a side hustle while you're working somewhere? Did you have a, crisis moment, like being laid off or something like that, that just threw you into it? And my other part two of that question is, did you already know entrepreneurs? Like, was that an
Oh,
idea that was sort of part of your world, or did you have to again figure it out as you
yeah,
were going?
yeah. So way back in the day, I did have a lawn mowing company, so I feel like that's always a thing. I was a landscaper, but that truly was, I love being outdoors as a little kid. So I had a friend whose dad was an entrepreneur and was like, just here's how you do it, like you knock on, your neighbor's doors and see if they need support and you have an offer, right? And so I did that for about 3 years, and it was one of the best jobs I ever had. And then I kind of, like I said, college was the expectation. So I went down that path. And my family, especially my father, was like, get a job with good benefits, all of that stuff. And so I took that kind of safer path. And a friend of yours, Dory Clark, I remember listening to her story of getting started, and she talked a lot about the illusion of being an employee, where it's like, oh, you're safe, you've got benefits and this and that. And she was talking about being a journalist, kind of 20 years ago, and just the massive layoffs that happened, and how she thought like she was on the safe path, and boom, unemployment arrived at her door. So that was kind of always like, and when I was listening to her talk about that story, I was at a place in my career where I did take that safe path. I was working for the city of New York, and I was leading up, I was serving as a policy advisor on kind of LGBT policy and practice for the city's child welfare agency. Big job. And I was having a lot of success in it, so much so that people from other jurisdictions were calling me saying, "How are you doing this? Can you help us?" And of course, I was like pro bono. I'm like, here's the blueprint. Here's how you do it. Just kind of like handing it out. And at some point, I was like, you know, I could be helping more cities do what I'm doing in one city. Why not create a business around this? Because no one else is doing it. So that's what I thought I was originally doing in the business that I started. I didn't know anyone in a field as an entrepreneur doing that kind of work. I mean, sure, I knew like DEI was out there. I was really interested in policy implementation, right? So after you advocate for the bills and after they're on the books, what happens to that? Like, who's implementing it? And the reality check is not a lot of people are doing that work, right? It's not sexy. Fighting for the bill, fighting for the legislation, yes, that's super sexy, but actually making sure it does the thing that you want it to do, not so much. So anyway, I started doing that work. And it felt like a giant leap into the unknown. I was scared out of my mind, so much so I told my family, I know you have a lot of feelings about this. I want you, if you feel like you want to talk to me and externalize, what I really need to hear is, I love you, I believe in you, keep going. And keep everything else, like write it down in a journal. You can share it with me later on. If I completely flop on my face, that's what I need right now. And believe it or not, they respected that boundary. Thank God, because I didn't want to know what was going on inside their minds. I had enough fear sitting on my shoulder. Still do today. Been doing this for about 10 years. It's still there. But yeah, I took that leap October of 2015, and it was the best decision I've ever made. And the work, obviously, in my first year, as I was doing this, I was thinking about the why. And it was so nice hearing you reflect that back earlier. Like, I was trying to find belonging, right? And I was missing that in a lot of areas of my life, and thinking like in the workplace, oh my God, that can never happen there. And then I was thinking like, what if like that was a given? Like, how amazing would it be where you spend the best waking hours of your day being surrounded by people that really see you, right? Like all of you, like the things that make you different in particular, is seeing that as a value, trusting you, supporting you, that collectively you feel a sense of pride. Like that's how I define belonging in the workplace. And what's the cost, right? When you feel invisible or disengaged, or like even shame, like there's something about you that's like the problem, and I was like, that has to change. So that started to get crystallized in kind of my first year of business. And so I started to kind of create a framework around that. And here I am today. And again, it was the best decision I've ever made, and the
Yeah.
scariest, right?
Yeah. But it sounds like you initially got a lot of traction because you knew people were coming to you.
Mhm.
And so you knew you had something of value to offer, and you had that voice in your head from Dory Clark talking about, and I repeat a lot of that too. Because my story with her, because she's been a big part of my story. We met in like 2008 or 9, 2008, I guess. And there was a point where she was trying to like almost, there was like an intervention dinner with all these people who either, were full time or like very strong entrepreneurs, like side hustles, were trying to convince me to leave my day job. And I, in that moment, suddenly was like, "Oh my god, but I love security and a paycheck and healthcare and benefits." And I sort of felt myself like squeezing onto something. And then I called her and I said I finally had a plan. And I was working for GLAAD, the LGBT legal rights organization. So I felt really connected to the cause. I'd been there for almost a decade. And I said, "All right, I have this plan." It was like a 2-year exit strategy. He said, "That's not an exit strategy." And then like a month or so goes by and I call her and I'm like, "All right, I gave my notice. I gave him 8 weeks and I leave in, November." So, but there was this way in which I had to sort of accept that, I was no more or less risky. It was like me choosing to live that way. my wife's been through a couple of layoffs in the last 5 years. And I have to say, like, yeah, what's the stability of that job?
Yeah.
Where I've had my own destiny. And I don't know, I didn't grow up believing that, but it was a script that I had to rewrite in my brain in order to do this work.
Yeah.
And I'm curious who helps you early on, since you didn't have initially like a strong entrepreneur community,
Mhm.
like were there mentors or guides or people who stepped out and gave you some supports or advice, or even granularly like helped you with admin? What were the pieces that you felt like you needed the most support, and where did you seek that community out? Because you seem very community driven.
Mhm.
So I can't imagine you just like operating solely in your own space, like in your basement, trying to like, I'm gonna figure this out. You're like,
Yeah.
how did you plug in,
Yeah.
and how do you find those people?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, podcasting. Podcasts are incredible. So as I was kind of mapping it out, and this was kind of like the last year where I was kind of working for an employer, so I totally get that. Like, I want a long, I want a long runway before I say goodbye to this, like, consistent paycheck and the benefits. So I stumbled upon the Being Boss podcast. Emily, oh, I'm going to forget their names, but they were so influential. Kathleen Shannon and Emily. Oh, I can't think of her last name, but that podcast, people check it out. It no longer is happening, but they had something over like three, similar to you, lots of podcasts. And it was really kind of the ins and outs of creative entrepreneurship, which I see myself as, but these are folks that are makers and they're like healing doulas and just kind of people that are pursuing businesses that it's not like marketing or communications, right? Like it's something really different, following their hearts and being able to make a living doing it. And that was hugely inspirational. And that was recommended by a friend who, uh, she's a tattoo artist. She has her own business and she's my tattoo artist. And I really respect her because she's never taken that traditional path of employment. So she was actually really influential to me, as well as my good friend Eli Green, who previously was the owner of the Teaching Transgender Institute. He as well, his whole career was is a business owner. And so those were like the three big influencers. And then as I moved into the DEI space, Jennifer Brown, who's incredible, really took me under her wing and even brought me onto some consulting projects to subcontract and kind of showed me the ropes to the field. And I have so much gratitude for her and her generosity, right? Because it's easy to kind of operate in that scarcity mindset, and she is just that inverse, like a growth mindset leader. And I really embrace that approach to. I try to give that back to folks who are younger entrepreneurs. And just to kind of close the loop, starting with podcast and ending, I realized, right, like starting my own business where I just, I, I wasn't trained to be an entrepreneur. So why not create a podcast where I interview entrepreneurs like 10, 20, 30 years down the road of how they did it, kind of working backwards of, how did you start? Like kind of some of the questions that you're asking here. And so, there's lots of entrepreneur podcasts out there. I was like, well, what would make this different? And I kind of did that kind of market research of, are there any podcasts that are specifically for LGBT entrepreneurs? And I couldn't find any at the time. Jen Grace had one that was on kind of like personal branding, because she comes from the marketing space. And so she kind of did a little of that. And I was interviewed on her show. And I asked her, I was like, hey, if I started a podcast, I'm thinking about calling it the Entrepreneur, would that be stepping on your toes? And she's like, no, not at all. So again, another kind of growth mindset person. So I was like, cool. All right, I'm going to try this out. And I did about 200 interviews. And then I kind of felt like, okay, I feel like this is complete. It's an offering for other kind of queer folks that are thinking about going down this path. And I loved it. I learned so much from it. And, probably similar to you on this podcast, the people that you get to meet, it was such an honor, that people would say, yes, I would love to be on your show, and that's what helped me get started and continue to build that confidence.
We're going to put links in the show notes at ontheschmooze.com to all the people and resources you just mentioned. So if people want to dig in a little deeper, we'll make sure those are there. I want to also share that I interviewed Jennifer Brown, episode 115, which is way back in 2018. And I still reference her show a lot because there's some things she talked about how she built her business from a solopreneur into what it is today and beyond. But that idea of like how she shifted from it being all her and who her first hires were and all of that, I found it really interesting. I do often send people to that episode to hear that origin story. I also, I mean, I interviewed Dory Clark, and so and there was times where I talked about her so much that episode 31. So that's back in
Oh, wow.
very beginning, 2017.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I definitely will put all those links in there. I love that you were using the podcast as a learning tool and a networking tool, I imagine as well. And that was helping you sort of figure out your way and like maybe avoid some common pitfalls and get some advice and input as you were growing. It's super smart because at the same time you're creating content to share and giving people a reason to check you out and learn from you and follow you and all of that. So you're building goodwill, you're adding great content, you're building connections, you're learning. I think it's a fantastic use of podcasting. It makes me happy to hear that description versus the people who say like, I'm going to host a podcast so I can earn money. And I'm like, that's a good way to spend money. I mean, I don't
Oh, yeah. Yes.
I'm not sure about the whole like get rich quick kind of thing. Um, but yeah, I agree. Like that's a model that I'm using too. And it's been a great way to learn and grow.
Mhm.
Um, your offer obviously evolved a lot. It sounds like as you were learning and paying attention to the market. What kept you from being a more pigeonholed, like trans inclusion expert? And there's nothing wrong with doing that. I just think that there's a way in which Black people are told to be DEI and to focus on race relations and like LGBT people are, like there's a way in which we're told like that's your story, so stick to it,
Yeah.
that's what your truth is. Teach people that. And you've expanded that a bit. How did that happen that you weren't just, yeah, like pigeonholed into a specific
Yeah.
slot? Like we need this kind of speaker. Okay, we're gonna check mark that box.
Mhm.
Is that again like conversations with people? Like how did that evolve?
Yeah. So thank you for seeing that, number one, because sometimes doing this work, people will see a practitioner and assume, like you said, oh, Rhodes, you're trans, so you must do gender inclusion work. And I do some of that for sure. Um, However, in doing this work, in order for it to succeed, it will be wildly incomplete, right? If you just focus on disability justice, right? And then, you're thinking about some of the experiences of maybe a Black neurodiverse trans single mom, right? Who, like, okay, so some of the accessibility work you're doing is great, but what about your racial justice work? Or what about your gender justice, right? So it's this, I wanted to approach this work in a way that was holistic without overwhelming. And that is, right, like that is, you know, it's it is an art to be able to get, number one, a leadership team to really invest in doing this work that cascades throughout an entire organization without wildly overwhelming them about what that vision looks like, and then targeted interventions that will make a big difference for people who are the most likely to be excluded in whatever workplace, that will benefit every single person in that organization if you do it well and you sustain it over time. And that is like the whole framework of my approach is based off of John A. Powell's work, which is targeted universalism. So the reason why I think people come to me at first is, oh, Rhodes does belonging. We love belonging because I belong. I'm the leader who belongs. So let's do it, right? And I mean, I spend time kind of celebrating why they belong. And then I often ask those leadership teams, right? Like, okay, so you've shared your experiences, right? Now let's think about the people in your organization furthest removed from your position of power. Do you believe that they also have that same kind of feeling of belonging? And either they get it and they're like, oh, no, we know what the numbers are, or wow, we've never thought about that before, right? And it's like that's where we start, right? We want everyone to have that feeling that you have. So let's talk about, one, how do we get that information of knowing who's feeling that and who's not, and then how do we actually build interventions that work around, centering the people least likely to feel that. And I think, like, by framing it that way, people are like, oh, we get it. We kind of get what you're doing, right? Without that context, people just, clients can fill in the blanks of what they don't know and then create a narrative of what you do and what you don't do. And that's not a good place to be as a business owner, right? So
Mhm.
there's some education work, and I have found, at least over this almost past decade, like that framework at least gets people curious and inviting me to actually fill in those blanks in a way that feels right for me, kind of running the business that I do.
My work before the pandemic for over a decade, I was speaking about networking at conferences and events. And I had this talk, Art of the Schmooze. It was my signature talk that I did, hundreds of times.
Mhm,
Um, and I never billed it as DE&I.
mhm.
But if you want to be good at networking,
Yeah.
you will be very conscious about how welcoming you are. You will avoid microaggressions as much as you can. You will think about how you create a space where people feel like they can bring more of their full selves, right? And you do it because it's to your advantage as a person who's trying to network. You do
Right.
it because it helps you, right? That's what makes most people want to do something, not because it's, politically correct or like it's just like, no, I mean, if you're trying to sell something or reach people or communicate something, going up to someone who's tall and saying, "Wow, you're really tall. How tall are you?" is probably not the it's most innocuous example I can ever give. And if you're under 12, maybe you'll say that, but if you're over 12, stop saying that. Right? And I had all these examples, and then I would say, maybe you look a lot like the other people in the room, so you didn't realize that what you thought was a compliment
Mhm,
was being perceived as a slight and making people feel othered and unwelcome. But I'm sure you can think of a time when you have felt like the only in the room. And so like that work was so effective at moving the conversation around practical things to do to create more welcoming spaces. And it was a sneaky way to have this really important conversation, but people left really open and receptive. Like I just felt people were not, when you have a DEI brown bag lunch thing, like people come, voluntold to be here. I don't need, it's like, or you're speaking to the choir who like totally gets it, who probably teach it. And it's hard to gather people from concept to action. And I was always about like super practical pieces. And even now, when I talk about inclusion and belonging in the context of like virtual events, events are about content and connection. How are we going to help people connect and engage?
mhm.
Similarly, when I'm talking about structure and design, I'm
Mhm.
talking about we all benefit when there's an agenda,
Yes.
right? I mean, there are some people who absolutely need the agenda in order to participate more
Mhm.
fully. And people like me who are an extrovert who are like, whatever, I'll answer the question. I don't even know what you're asked yet. I'm ready to start talking.
Yeah.
But if we don't consciously design, we're only going to hear my voices, like the voice of people like me. And
Mhm.
that kind of we all, the universalism of how we all benefit when we make certain changes. If we make changes that help certain people, it's actually benefiting all of us. I think that's been a shift in the way DEI work has been approaching
Mhm.
this, as opposed to like politically correct, which people really heavily push back on, or special needs or special access. It's like, well, no, it's about universal access, not ADA compliant.
Mhm.
So I love the way this conversation is evolving, and that I know more and more people who are coming into this space around the human at work aspect. And it feels also like a very like um, futurists kind of like the people who are predisposed to be leaning towards like imagining a future.
Mhm.
It feels like they have muscles around doing this work that a lot of people still need. And
Mhm.
I've been seeing this interesting overlap of that, because you have to have quite the imagination sometimes to see a different kind of vision for what life could be like. Kind of like what you were saying, like what if I could be more of myself at work? What, back going, 10 plus years ago,
Yeah.
that was not a, that was a very futuristic kind of idea of workplaces. Um, so I love like I feel like you're on the edge of something and you're also a leader. I'm a little curious now to know just about this group that you built around other consultants and, internal, uh, I'll say change agents within their companies, or are they, as they sometimes call them, intrapreneurs, which I kind of love that term.
Yeah.
Um, what was your idea around building that? Because for some people, it's all about competition and we all do the same thing. So I can't tell anyone who you are. Another way you and I share value wise is you don't buy that. And you create spaces for people to gather.
Yeah.
What was the initiative to create that
Mhm.
space? Like that's work, right? That's not
Yeah.
an easy thing. And
Yeah.
you could have just hung your own shingle and gone on your merry way, but you chose to have more of a leadership role.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. That community is like my favorite thing of my business. And I wouldn't say it's kind of the bread and butter of the business. It just is. It's such a lifeline for me, and I think other practitioners that are there. And the inspiration to start it was March of 2020. The wheels really were kind of like flying off of the DEI profession. So it's hard to imagine, before May of 2020 and the police murder of George Floyd. But between March and May of that year, and I write about this in Imagine Belonging, there's a graphic from Glassdoor. It looked at DEI jobs for that employers were hiring. And that dip was so significant because budgets were contracting. And the first thing to go was anything kind of related to culture building work, DEI. So the field experienced a massive loss. And I was like, okay, like in this moment, what can I do? Because I'm doing okay. Like I have my clients, like that work is stable. And so I put a call out, to people that I knew that were in the space. And I said, hey, like, why not just like connect every week? That's what we started, was like every week, and really just kind of talk through what we're seeing, talk through what we're finding that's working, to kind of defend these precious workplace gains, and also kind of imagine and dream about how we move through this, right? And wow, that was such a I'm glad that I put like the email out and people showed up. I mean, it was just kind of simple Zoom sessions. And then, when the police murder of George Floyd happened, and that was May 25th of that year, then like the amount of work that was placed on the shoulders of people showing up was extraordinary, and it felt like this is a moment that we can't let pass. It felt it felt I mean, the circumstances were awful, right? And the responses of businesses were encouraging. And you could look at that Glassdoor chart, looking at May and beyond, those jobs just shot up. And obviously we're in a different year now. But that was the motivation. And we've been meeting ever since. We meet monthly. Yeah, it's fantastic. It's, yeah.
Again, this is a place where you and I have like a mirrored a mirrored journey, because my work was all about in-person events up till March 2020. My TEDx talk came out 2 months earlier and it was about
Uh,
networking at conferences, and
yeah.
no one was doing at anything except at home.
Yeah.
So I hosted my first virtual happy hour March 13th, 2020, kind of in a, well, it's something I can do right now. And then hosted it weekly for 2 years, and it's now monthly. Became the No More Bad Zoom virtual happy hour within like a month.
Yeah.
Um, and similarly, like it's the best thing I could have done. Like it helped me figure out where to go forward for myself and what people's needs were. And I supported a lot of people. And now I have the Content and Connection Club to
Yeah.
help people continue to grow. And it's the people who I've seen almost on a weekly basis now for years and years, those relationships that really got to develop. And like you, those skill levels around using Zoom and feeling comfortable bringing people together in this new format started to also become part of what I could do for myself and for other people. So kudos to you. We're about to get to my favorite wrap up question, but first, we're going to have a quick word from our sponsor. All right. It's a year from now. I know we're not going to wait a whole year to talk to each other, Rhodes, but let's say it's a year from now. And I remember, or you remember, that it's been a year since this conversation. I'm going to then ask you what you're celebrating lately. What are we toasting? So I'm curious, what are you most looking forward to in the year ahead?
Yes, I love that question. We are toasting to the success of the Belonging Circle, which are quarterly gatherings for any people leader who's really trying to make their way through the world that we're in right now. But it's already happened. So success has happened. We survived our field being kind of the epicenter of bad things, and people now understand kind of the reality of how essential doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work is in the workplace. And they can see the vision. Maybe it's not happening now, right? But they can see a vision of the culture of their workplace that is a belonging culture, and they know the pathway on how to get there. They can name it, they can describe it, and it's happening.
I love this. I can't wait to celebrate that with you. and of course support you in getting there as well. Speaking of which, how can people find you and follow your work?
Really simple. It's just rhodesperry.com, and you'll find out about the belonging circle, the belonging community, and lots of other good stuff there. And thank you
Well,
so much. This was fantastic.
yeah, no, it was a great conversation. We're also going to put links to your podcasts, your YouTube channel, your LinkedIn, your Instagram, your books. We've got all of that at ontheschmooze.com. Rhodes, thank you so much for joining us. This has been really an engaging conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie. This was